They say every champion has a beginning. But if you had seen Darius that first afternoon, sitting alone at the edge of the cafeteria, shoulders bent low as though gravity itself pressed harder on him than anyone else in the room, you might not have believed he would ever wear the word champion in the same sentence as his name. You might have thought him invisible, unnoticeable, lost somewhere between lockers and laughter, little more than a ghost drifting through hallways painted with murals he had never been invited to pose for. And that is where our story really begins. Inside those moments the world forgets. If you've ever felt unseen, misunderstood, or underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this is not just Darius's story, but the story of everyone who has ever carried quiet fire waiting for the right time to show it. I remember every detail as though etched into memory with the sharpness of glass. The way his shoes squeaked softly on the tile floor as he crossed the cafeteria that day, moving quickly, hoping, futilely, to reach the safety of a corner seat before the others noticed him. The way the afternoon sun sliced through the tall windows and glared against the polished surface of his cheap plastic tray, casting long shadows behind him like echoes of his own shrinking presence. The world inside that cafeteria was not kind. It was governed by invisible lines of territory drawn by those who sat at the center tables, those who felt entitled to hold court, kings and queens in sneakers, rulers by mockery and intimidation. Darius had no place within their circle, only the edge, the outskirts, where laughter from their table often rolled like thunder toward him, shaking his confidence until even the act of eating lunch felt like walking into storm winds. That day the storm broke quickly. 3 boys approached, swaggering the way only boys drunk on their own belonging do, their footsteps heavy and deliberate, their shadows falling across his tray before their voices cut through the air like knives. "Hey, what's on the menu, loser? Mystery stew again? You're probably the only one desperate enough to eat it." Their leader, tall, wiry, with a cruel smile sharpened by the approval of his friends, plucked one of Darius's fries and twisted it slowly between his fingers before flicking it back onto the tray. The others laughed, not because the moment was funny, but because laughter keeps the pack strong, keeps them bonded in cruelty. Darius didn't answer. He kept his eyes fixed on the tray, on the blurred reflection of his own face in the spilled water below the plastic cup, as though by lowering his gaze he could become invisible, as though stillness was a shield. But invisibility is never a shield. It is always an invitation for more. One of them leaned closer, voice dripping with mock concern. "You still playing make-believe out there on the courts, huh? Think you're some kind of baller? You dribble like my grandma, man. Don't you get tired of embarrassing yourself?" The words stung, though Darius hid the flinch. What they didn't know, and what even I didn't fully realize at that moment, was that outside of these halls, beyond the gaze of these bullies, he had put in more hours of sweat-soaked training than any of them combined. Alone in cracked community courts, by dim streetlights that flickered above pavements still wet with rain, Darius practiced until his fingers bloomed with calluses, until his shoes tore at the seams, until the rhythm of bounce and breath and drive seeped into his bones like a heartbeat. But none of that mattered inside the cafeteria, where power wasn't measured in skill, but in how loudly you spoke, how fearlessly you mocked. He remained still, stacking his books carefully when they shoved them aside, pretending not to care when one of them tipped his water just enough to soak the edge of his notebook, words bleeding into blue smears across the paper. If you looked close enough, though, you would have seen it, just a flicker in his eyes. As he bent down to rescue his things, the glimmer of something sharp and untamed, something not broken but waiting. Later that afternoon, I followed the story into the gym, where wooden floors gleamed under fluorescent lights and the same boys prowled louder than ever, waiting for another opportunity to make him stumble. The coach called for volunteers during scrimmage practice, and for a fraction of a second, the silence that followed was suffocating. I expected Darius to keep his head down, to wave the moment away, to stay hidden in anonymity as he always had. But instead, with a movement so quiet it was almost hesitant, Darius rose from the bench, and the gym seemed to pause. Something in that instant told me part one of his story was ending, that the quiet boy shuffling past cracked lockers was stepping towards something larger, though he hadn't yet revealed to anyone, not even himself, the full weight of what he carried. That moment burned itself into memory, because it was the beginning of the unraveling. the crossroads where the bullied boy's silence brushed against the edge of transformation. And though the bully still didn't see it, I did. The atmosphere shifted, subtly, like the first current of wind before a storm, whispering that soon, very soon, their laughter would come to an abrupt and unexpected halt. It was in the gym where the story truly started to breathe, where the echo of bouncing balls fused with the squeak of sneakers to shape a language louder than taunts or whispers. And when Darius stepped into the center of that polished court, pulling the sweatshirt over his head and tossing it aside without looking, the shift in the air became undeniable, like the drop in pressure before a storm breaks open. And though the boys who had mocked him carried themselves with loud confidence, their laughter stretched a little too far. Their sneers filled the silence left by nervous curiosity that grew in the bleachers as more eyes turned toward the quiet kid, now holding the ball. The coach, who knew more than he let on, and had perhaps waited patiently for this exact moment, blew the whistle, the shrill notes slicing through the air, and the scrimmage began. 2 sides, 5 on 5. A dozen restless bodies fighting for movement, for space, for the brief chance at glory on the hardwood. At first, no one passed it to him. Why would they? Darius wasn't a name that carried weight in their circles, not in those hallways defined by bluster and bravado. But then the ball skidded free after a sloppy play, and he seized it without hesitation, palms closing around rubber with the kind of familiarity that only comes from hours of repetition in empty courts. And in that instant something inside him switched, subtle but irrepressible, as his dribble met the floor in a steady, perfect rhythm that grew louder with each bounce. One of the bullies lunged toward him, too casual, too sure of himself, but Darius's body moved like water. A lightning-quick crossover that sent the boy stumbling in the opposite direction, arms flailing to regain balance, while gasps and a quick burst of laughter erupted from the bleachers. Another stepped forward, jaw tight, determined not to let him pass, but Darius pivoted, spun full circle, ball tethered to his hand like it was part of his body, and slipped through the defender as though the gate had never been closed at all. Now the gym was alive, voices rising, sneakers pounding behind him as footsteps gave chase, but Darius didn't flinch. He drove toward the hoop, rose, and laid the ball up with a clean, effortless flick that kissed the backboard and dropped through the net as the buzzer echoed faintly. It wasn't the buzzer for the end of play, but it might as well have been, because everything shifted at that exact second. The bleachers no longer whispered, they shouted. The boys who had smirked at him minutes earlier glanced at each other, nervous smiles faltering, their camaraderie thinning as realization crept into their eyes. He was not the boy they thought he was, not the easy target they had bent their jokes around. He was something else entirely, and that shook them in ways their mouths couldn't admit. But this was only the beginning. The coach, arms crossed, gave the smallest nod, silently urging him on, and when the ball found its way back into Darius's hands, it almost felt deliberate, as though the game itself wanted to see what would happen next. This time they doubled him, 2 bodies crowding close, arms high, voices barking distractions meant to rattle him. But his footwork was precise, honed from nights cutting across cracked pavement, dodging shadows that stood in for defenders, practicing until sweat stung his eyes and his lungs burned for air, a language of muscle memory no schoolyard bully could strip from him. He dropped low, hesitation dribble, then exploded forward, the space he needed blooming suddenly like a door opening, and he pulled up with a jump shot so pure that the ball arced in perfect silence before whispering through the net with nothing but string to announce its landing. That silence was electric, an exhale that turned into cheers, students rising higher, voices clashing over one another, already rewriting the narrative in their heads. Darius wasn't background, wasn't invisible. He was possibility incarnate, and possibility has a way of remaking reputations faster than gossip ever could. Even the bullies' allies in the bleachers began to shift uncomfortably, their smirks uneasy, as though unsure whether to laugh as before or to cheer like everyone else, because loyalty to cruelty dries up fast when awe takes its place. Yet Darius said nothing. His silence, the same silence they once mistook for weakness, was now heavy with intent, his eyes focused, his breathing steady, as though the entire room existed only to mirror the countless nights he had trained alone in the dark, chasing a dream no one thought belonged to him. and me. I couldn't peel my eyes away, because what we were witnessing wasn't just a boy dribbling past defenders. It was transformation. Each step he took rewriting the rules of who he was allowed to be in this world. Each shot he made burning through years of mockery, like fire through dry grass. Still, the bullies weren't done. Humiliation doesn't sit easily on proud shoulders, and as sweat began to bead across their brows, they pushed harder, fouled more aggressively, used elbows and angry words to try to shove him back into the corner he had lived in so long. But every hit he absorbed only steadied him further. Every jibe melted against the armor forged by his discipline. I realized then that this wasn't about basketball. It never really had been. It was about identity, about proof, about forcing the truth into the open where no insult could erase it again. And part of me almost pitted the boys chasing him across the court, because they were not only up against Darius that day, they were up against every midnight shot he had ever taken, every failure he had turned into practice, every hour he had bitten back frustration to keep moving. They were up against inevitability itself, and inevitability, once it announces itself, doesn't lose. And the more his moves lit the gym with brilliance, the more visible that inevitability became, until by the time the coach blew the final whistle, no one in the room doubted it anymore. The boy they had dismissed as frail was in fact untouchable, and though the game ended, the true contest, the one for respect, for recognition, had only just begun, burning hotter in the silence that followed than in the shouts that came before. The final whistle should have ended the game, but it didn't in the moment. Not truly, because the silence that followed in the gym was the kind that holds more weight than thunder. It was a silence stuffed with the realization of every person who had just witnessed the transformation of a boy they had once overlooked into something they could no longer deny. And I swear you could feel the weight of that recognition pressing against the bleachers, pressing into every breath, until even the bullies who had strutted in with laughter burning at their lips could not find the words to mask the tremor in their chests. Darius stood there in the center of it all, sweat glistening across his forehead, chest rising and falling with controlled restraint. The ball balanced casually on the tips of his fingers like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there, tethered not to his hands but to his very identity. And he looked around only once, deliberately, meeting the eyes of those who had once mocked him, scanning their collapsing bravado as though weighing the justice of the moment before turning away with a calm that seemed unreal for his age. No triumphant shout tore from his throat, no cocky grin spread across his face. Because victory for him was never about the noise, never about the show. It was about the proof, the long, unshakable truth that burned brighter than any insult flung his way. And that truth now hung in the air like a banner no one could tear down. Coach moved forward first, clapping a heavy hand on Darius's shoulder with a pride that spoke louder than words. And I could tell by the way the coach's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening faintly, that he had known this day would come, that he had waited to see the boy everyone treated as invisible finally step into the light. And it struck me in that instant. Some champions are not born in stadiums or under spotlights, but in the shadows of cafeteria corners, in silence, in the long echoes of empty gyms when no one is watching. The students rose slowly at first, clapping cautiously as though unsure whether celebrating him meant challenging the old order. But then a handful of voices broke into chants, his name, over and over, rising like a pulse that grew louder until the whole gym vibrated with rhythm, until even those who had laughed at him a day before found themselves swept into the current, their resistance drowned in the tide of something truer, something impossible to deny. And in the middle of it, the bullies stood diminished, their shoulders hunched, cheeks flushed, eyes darting everywhere but toward him, because what could they say now? What joke could they conjure to erase what all had seen? Insults stopped working when truth stands taller, and Darius, in that moment, was taller than anyone in that room. One of them tried. I saw him open his mouth, chin lifting as though to bark a retort that might snatch back a sliver of dignity. But the words never came, because Darius finally spoke first, his voice low but steady, a voice that carried across the gym without having to shout. I wasn't pretending. For 2 years, I trained. State champ. Ask coach, he'll show you the trophies. The words weren't defensive. They weren't bragging either. They were just facts placed gently on the table, facts too heavy for anyone to move. and their simplicity struck harder than any anger could. You could almost hear the bullies shrinking inside themselves as murmurs spread through the crowd, kids nodding, whispering to each other, piecing it together. Of course, it made sense now. The way he moved, the way the ball seemed to obey him without question, the way he never broke under pressure. This had all been there the whole time, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to give him the stage. The chants surged again, louder this time, rising into something electric, and I thought, the cafeteria, the hallways, the locker room, all of it would never be the same again, because reputation, like a tide, shifts suddenly, and once it does, the old shoreline disappears forever. Darius didn't linger in the spotlight, though, after the noise had swelled to its peak, after the bullies had all but melted into the background, after the realization that a new order had been written in sweat and discipline, he simply spun the ball once on his finger, caught it, and walked quietly off the court. But the way the crowd parted for him in that moment, it wasn't out of mockery anymore. It wasn't out of derision. It was respect, pure and unspoken, like a curtain lifting to make room for something greater than anyone had expected to arrive. And I remember thinking, as I watched the boy they had once pushed to the fringe now stride confidently through the center, that this was more than victory in basketball. This was reclamation. This was the rightful crown placed on someone who had been denied it for too long. He didn't need to smirk at the boys who had mocked him, didn't need to throw their cruel words back at them, because walking out with his head up, with the chants of his name echoing like drums behind him, was victory enough. Victory so absolute it stripped them of their weapons. Even so, something deeper lingered in me watching him cross that threshold, and understanding that his true battle had never been with them, but with the world that had told him to stay small, to stay silent, to stay unseen. And he had won, not by becoming louder than them, but by being truer than anyone could deny. That's how I will always remember him. Not in the cafeteria where he shrunk away from their shadows, but in the gym where he outpaced them with light, where pure dedication wrote its testimony across the hardwood floor, burning away every trace of ridicule. And though the game ended, though the players filed back to the locker rooms, though the coach eventually switched off the lights to close the day, in that gym, in that moment, something permanent was written into the air. A boy mocked for his silence and underestimated for his skin had, through sheer discipline and fire, turned mockery into silence of a different kind. The silence of awe, the silence of respect, the silence reserved only for champions.